Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is the briefing. Global temperatures are now more likely than not to breach 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within the next 5 years, according to the World Meteorological Organization. One of the key tools at our disposal is protecting existing forests, such as the Amazon, to avoid further losses and start working on their regeneration. Forests serve as carbon sinks by absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, but illegal logging, land conversion and mining all pose an ongoing threat. Ojo Público is a Peruvian investigative journalism website founded in 2014. Intent on holding those involved in the destruction of the forest to account, they've undertaken numerous innovative projects using data analysis, document gathering, and on-the-ground reporting. We polled our journalist fellows to ask, if you could control the editorial budget in your newsroom and you had to choose between two approaches, which would you put your money into as a method for raising awareness about the climate crisis? 16.7% said, launch ambitious environmental investigations on important topics. 41.7% said, train more journalists across beats to look for climate angles. 41.7% said, dang it, why can't I do both? Today, we'll meet David Hidalgo, an award-winning journalist and author, founding member and news director of Ojo Público, to learn more about their approach. That's the briefing. Let's begin.
Good afternoon and welcome to another Global Journalism Seminar. I'm Caitlin Mercer and today we're spending time with David Hidalgo. David is news director at Ojo Público, a Peruvian digital investigative media outlet with a storied history that we'll hear more about today. He's also the author of a book about the last armed action by terrorist group MRTA in Peru and a multiple award-winning investigative journalist. He was part of the team that won the Global Editors Network Data Journalism Award, and he won the Human Rights and Journalism Award twice in 2006 and 2015. David was a fellow of the 2009 Edward R. Murrow Program for Journalists, and he joins us today at the crack of dawn in Peru. So thank you so much for getting up early to speak to us, David.
Thank you, Kaylin. Nice to be here and honored for being invited to the seminar.
Before we dive into the amazing environmental investigations that your team has undertaken, I just want to cover two questions that aren't necessarily related. First, for those of us who don't know, can you tell us the story of how Ojo Público was formed?
Well, Ojo Público was formed like a garage rock band in which we worked at home, where we were four journalists that gathered to establish a new site or new media in order to publish complex, long stories with stories that require a lot of resources in terms of time and economic resources also. And we, at that moment, we didn't find any place to publish it because at that time, all the legacy media and the industry in Peru were reducing their teams, reducing their costs. So there was no place in which you can publish these kinds of stories. So we analyzed the situation and we decided that instead of creating a new magazine or a new newspaper that could be dying 2 years later, we started to take advantage of the internet and the possibilities to create a new site that was free and that offered all the possibilities that you can imagine. And at that time we were watching and we were attentive to what was happening in the industry around the world. So we were reading the stories published by the New York Times, The Guardian, and other biggest media. Yeah. And we decided that what we wanted to do that kind of stories. We had the stories, but the methodology and all the approach could be or should be learned because we didn't have that knowledge at that moment. We did not have the knowledge of how to work in the new with the new storytelling ways in which all these papers and media in the international scene were covering these stories. So we decided to do something like that, and we started, and 2 or 3 years later, we could manage the team. And at the moment, we are 15 journalists working in the newsroom.
15,
So,
15.
yes.
Small but mighty team.
Sorry?
A small but mighty team.
Yeah. Yeah, where it's a very young team, and the founders are veteran journalists.
Yeah.
And we are always training new journalists in this new approach and with the methodologies that we learned during these years.
And now, just a few years later, you're publishing a handbook that the international media can actually look to learn from. So
sure.
We'll talk more about that later. But before we dive into the environment stories, I do want to ask, what's going on in Peru? How are you? Is your team safe? What's the mood like?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. In Peru, there's currently a political crisis that it has been in the same critical situation for the last 4 years at least. But since the December of 2022, the political crisis got to a breaking point because the president at that moment tried to dissolve the Congress, so illegally. So he was expected from the position, and we have a new president.
What was his motivation for trying to dissolve that Congress?
Well, at that moment, he has been investigating. He was investigated in the Congress and in the prosecutor's office due to some allegations of corruption. And I think that a couple of days before a critical session of the Congress, he decided to close the Congress. So it was against the Constitution, and he had no support at the moment, not from the political class, and neither from some of the people in the southern regions in Peru that voted for him massively, but not in the capital. So he lost the power very quickly, and the vice president took office. But there was a political and social crisis from that moment to now that was, for example, there was a lot of protests in the southern regions in Peru and in the center of the country also, and even in the capital, but not so hard like the ones in the southern regions. So due to the repression of the political forces and the army, there has been at least 60 people deaths for organizations, and even the International Commission for Human Rights says that there has been a lot of human rights abuses in this repression. So it's a complex situation right now in Peru, and we're trying to explain the situation, all the interests involved in this, and responsibilities that should be matter of trial in the future.
I think it's a good segue to go to these environmental stories, because in essence, a lot of them represent some of the corruption that was the flashpoint for this ongoing crisis. So let's start with, I'm going to share my screen on and off throughout this, so that you can see. I think a particular lesson to learn from Ojo Público is how they present their stories, because they're just so visually striking. But let's start with this beautiful story, and I'm just going to hit refresh so it loads from the beginning. All right, tell us a little bit about the universal language of truth and what inspired this and
Sure, this is a project that maybe could explain to you the coverage and how we are always interested in not just covering the stories in the regions, for example, in the Amazon and other regions in Peru, but also to get those audiences, and in some cases, some audiences that are, for example, vulnerable populations that in the past didn't have access to these stories. So we decided to create an alliance of media outlets. Some of them are radio stations that operate in some isolated regions, like this one, for example. This is a town in the northern zone of the Amazon. And in this radio, they spread some of the content that we create in native languages. So we work in Spanish, but sometimes we prepare these contents translated to some of the Amazon languages or the Andean languages, native languages. And we spread all these stories through this network of radio stations. And this is the map of Peru, and in north, the green zone is the Amazon, obviously, and the brown zone is the coast and the Andean region. So you can see all the yellow points are the zones in which the radio stations are operating. Okay. So they help us to share with these communities all the stories that we cover and publish in the site in Lima. No? As you probably imagine, in these zones, there's poor access to internet or even to the radio stations. So in some towns, for example, they don't have access even to radio. So they spread the news in some I don't know how you say, Juan, in megaphones. I don't know if you understand.
They play it over megaphones?
Yeah.
Speakers,
yes. And just megaphones in the center of the town. So that's the way in which they get the news. So they spread the news and our content with megaphones in those zones.
Wow.
That could give you an idea of how isolated are these zones and the way in which we can reach these audiences. So and this is we could explain you how we work in the Amazon region and the Andean region.
It's brilliant. So it bringing together reporting from local radio stations through kind of the medium of Google Earth.
Yes. Well, this is a way to explain how spread is the project in Peru, because we usually send the content through WhatsApp. So they receive the content in WhatsApp and they spread the content in the radio stations. That's the easiest way to do it.
And how much information sharing is there? Is it one way, or do they send sort of information back to you of potential stories?
Mostly it's one way. We prepare the content and they help us to spread this content in these languages, in these regions. But sometimes they send us some questions or some tips about a story, and we cover that story, and eventually we prepare a report, a journalistic product, and we translate it, and we can share it again with them, the result in a brief podcast translated to their languages. And one of the very interesting results of this is when some of them tell us that in the past they didn't receive this content in their languages, and they feel that this is a kind of respectful way to reach them. So and sometimes when we publish some stories on, for example, the COVID crisis, they feel that we help them to prevent the consumption of, for example, some products that could be harmful They didn't know nothing about it until we explained it in this content.
What was some of the misinformation around COVID happening in Peru?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of disinformation, that this is part of the whole crisis. If you see the crisis in the whole landscape, you can identify interests from political parties, political authorities, and independent groups that are aligned to these conservative groups, and different kind of interests that promoted some disinformation, not just for the COVID crisis, but with an agenda behind that. So,
Right.
for example, these conservative groups promoted disinformation, but also are promoting new regulations that are conservative and that reduce the rights of some of communities, like LGBT communities or something like that. And they are the same, they have the same agenda, and they use this information in order to gain some more participation in the discussion. So
yeah,
that's the kind of situation that have been happening in Peru, and we try to face in our coverage.
And you were telling me this earlier, but for those who don't know, how many languages are spoken in Peru?
In Peru, there are 48 languages. Most of them are spoken in the Amazon, and in the Andean region. The main language is Quechua. That was the most extended originally language in Peru, and the whole country speaks as an official language as the Spanish.
Great. And tell me, how does Google get involved? And is Google involved in this? Was there collaboration with the Google News Initiative on this project?
Not in this specific project, but we are currently working with Google. We obtained a Google funding last year that will allow us to develop a platform that could help small newsrooms like these radio stations in the regions in the Andes and the Amazon. This platform would help them to develop content in fact-checking content in original languages in an automatized way, and in 3 native languages. So they will help this network to produce more content and more frequently in a more easy way. And this is a project that we're developing with the help of Google.
Yeah. When you see that map and the vastness and how separated those communities are, you can see how vital radio must be as a media source and how crucial it is to translate reliable information.
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, if you don't imagine this, I can tell you that in some communities, for example, when at the beginning of the crisis, of the COVID crisis, we tell them in this podcast, don't take this product, go to the doctor, go to the hospital. And the reply was, what doctor, what hospital?
Wow.
We live in some places that we need to take about 12 hours to travel 12 hours to get the nearest doctor in this region. So there's it's not easy for us. There are some regions in which they cannot find a doctor for hours or days. So you cannot tell us that we need to go to the doctor because there's no doctor here. So that was the kind of situation that we need to understand. This project helped us to overcome the cultural bridges and social bridges that are part of the life in our country like Peru.
Yeah. All right, let's dive into some hardcore environmental coverage here. I want to talk about the lost fauna story. Let's see if that's sharing. So I've asked Google to translate to English for us, but this is
okay. This is an investigation, a transnational collaborative investigation about wildlife trafficking in the Amazon.
Great.
And this investigation was published in alliance with an organization, a Brazilian organization called Informazonia. And we tried to uncover and to explain the complexity of the wildlife trafficking as one of the illicit and criminal activities in the Amazon. And one thing that I wanted to share with you is the idea that we need to consider the Amazon as one of the largest crime scenes in the world.
Wow.
There are a lot of illegal activities. Illegal wildlife trafficking is one of them, but there are drug traffickers, timber traffickers, poachers, illegal mining operators and groups. And this zone is threatened by all these kind of groups and criminal organizations. And when you in the past, when you talked about traffic of wildlife, the people in Peru just thought about the people that sell, for example, some turtles in markets in Lima, for example. They thought that that was the final proof of wildlife trafficking, but we started to make a very deep investigation, and we discovered, for example, the participation of some authorities in this region involved or related to groups that are involved in illegal fishing and or the traffic of ornamental fish in the Amazon. And I'd like to say at this moment that explaining how we cover these stories, that we do not consider that we publish environmental stories, we publish crime stories. That is a point of view that gave us a sense of what we need to cover, how we need to cover it, and the importance of identifying individual responsibilities in this process. So when we cover a story, we always try to trace or to follow the traces, to chase these traces, to identify who is involved, if the authorities had previous notice of this or not, are involved in these activities or not. And that's an approach that helps us to develop new ways to cover this kind of problems.
Yeah. I want to point something out on this story. Let me quickly share my screen again. The size of the team involved. Was it just these three stories?
Yeah, at this moment, this was these three stories, but there are a lot of stories that we published after that.
After this.
And as you can see there, this is a project called the Cross-Border Investigative Network. That it's a network that we developed at that time because we understood that the coverage and the complexity of these problems should be addressed with a new methodology.
Yeah.
You need to new logic for this coverage. You need to understand that the only way to publish more accurate and compelling stories on these crimes and these environmental problems need to follow, for example, the dynamics of the organized crime. It's transnational, that uses the flaws of the system, that takes advantages of, for example, the links with other criminal activities or other interests, like, for example, the political authorities that are founded by these criminal organizations or criminal people that involved in criminal or illicit activities. So in order to explain these kind of problems, you need to follow this complexity. You need to follow the traces that are not that are not limited to a national border.
Right.
It's usually transnational. You need to cover this with the help of journalists in other countries, and eventually in the whole region, the whole Latin American region. This investigation involved people investigating in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and that was the only way we could explain some of these cases, some of these situations.
And that really struck me that when you think about organized crime, something they're really, really good at that we're not really, really good at is collaboration and cross-border collaboration.
Absolutely.
So you're right, there's a lot to learn.
There was a learning, I would say that was a learning that we had during experience and the coverage of the Panama Papers investigation that you probably remember. The Panama Papers investigation was a breaking point in the journalistic practice, because we learned that we could share a story and we could share a project investigating a complex issue. And that gave us a lot of reach, a lot of access to different kind of resources. We could share our own resources with other media outlets, independently if they are small newsrooms like ours or biggest newspapers or media companies. So this new, this learning in this investigation help us to develop and design new investigations focusing in Latin America, focusing in the Amazon, and specifically in the problems, environmental problems in the region.
So, David, I'm having so much fun talking to you that I've lost track of time completely. And usually at this point, we would be going over to questions, but I think it's too important. Let's keep going on the lessons that we can learn from these different stories. If the audience will forgive me, I will try my very, very best to get through these. But I think the lessons that you have to share are incredibly important. So if you have questions related to the lessons, please use the Q&A feature or the WhatsApp group. And I just wanted to highlight, you have a data visualization team is specifically highlighted in the credits on this team. Let me see if I can refresh this page, because it's worth seeing how that chart unfolds. Quite horrifying. Where is it gone? This one. Tell us what we're looking at here.
Okay, well, maybe I could mention that one of the learnings that we had since the beginning of the project of the Ojo Público as an investigative project or media outlet was that the technology gave us an opportunity to use new tools to investigate. Nice. In the past, the journalists usually follow trace of some cases and could explain a complex situation by detailing all the situations of a specific case. But the technology gave us the opportunity to analyze a huge amount of data that could explain complex situation. So, for example, we usually work with public data that we ask through requests of information. That in Peru, it works pretty well. And we use the data as a tool to prove some situations, but also to find new cases and new stories. For example, if you are trying to doing an investigation on wildlife trafficking, in the past, you probably need to go to the place, and the only way and the only most probably way to investigate this situation, this a case, would be to go there and to find a source and to follow the trace of a case and maybe uncover a story, maybe, but the technology gave us the opportunity to analyze huge amounts of data, for example, about the companies that are that have permission to, for example, to manage a breeding farm, for example. And if you analyze all the information about this breeding farm, you can obtain the connections of the owners of this breeding farm. You can connect that information with other databases, public databases that, for example, show that one of the owners of this breeding farm was involved in a trafficking case in the past, and you can follow all the stories and obtain new ways to link activities that and the other way should be very difficult to link. So analyzing these stories, you can mix data, you can analyze with some tools. For example, we use frequently OpenRefine tool.
OpenRefine.
For example, could help us to analyze and to clean all databases that are usually dirty. And we could obtain some stories from that. We can obtain some the first steps of new cases or new investigations, just analyzing the data. And of course, later we need to go to do the on-the-ground investigations, of course, but that's a new way to explain situations with data that is reliable. If you work in a proper way, is reliable and more compelling and accurate.
So what skills are you looking for when you hire data journalists, and how many are you putting on a team?
Well, I think that we first look at the curiosity of the person. We need a person that is curious, that is ready to learn, that is willing to develop new abilities, new learning, that is open to different storytelling methods. And this, it's always looking for what's going on in the social media, because there are a lot of storytelling developing in this moment. Eventually, in the conversation of what you're searching or what you're looking in the social media, what are we researching, we can obtain some ideas that could be powerful and compelling. So I think that the most valuable asset in a new journalist is the curiosity and the willingness to learn.
Yeah, you can teach everything else, but you can't teach curiosity.
Absolutely.
All right, and then you don't just do data journalism, you do put actual boots on the ground and for incredibly important stories. This had 3 journalists going to the Brazilian-Peruvian border.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about both the story and how you secured the safety of this trio of journalists.
Well, this is another example of this approach in which you need to gather journalists in different countries or develop a network for investigating complex issues. And for example, in this story, we exposed the penetration of a criminal organization from Brazil in the territory of Peru. And this is another example of how criminal organizations are always participating or involved in the trafficking on different kinds of illegal activities in the Amazon.
Right.
So in the past, you usually thought that maybe drug trafficking was more a most common idea of what could be a criminal activity in the Amazon. But in the current times, we now understand that a lot of criminal activities have the same dynamics. For example, if you follow the trace of the illegal timber trafficking, you can understand how the criminal organizations work even inside the system. For example, they obtain some fake certificates to clean the wood that they extract illegally from the Amazon, and they try to use these certificates to sell these illegal woods to another markets, and this wood ends up in some markets in Europe or US with these certificates, but these are fake documents, official documents. In some cases prepared, but functionaries that are involved with these organizations. This dynamic is the same, or it's equal than what we found when investigating the illegal fishing or illegal trafficking of ornamental fish in the northern of the Amazon in Peru, for example. It's the same dynamic of the illegal mining and these groups that are trying to sell the gold from illegal mining to the markets in Europe.
Yeah.
In which they obtain fake certificates or fake permissions in order to clean the products and to sell them to markets that are supposedly regulated to prevent the consumption of products that have illegal origin. But this is a kind of activity that you can show as a proof of the penetration of the criminal organizations in the system.
Okay, so we have a perfect example of looking into that with the IKEA Falabella story, where allegedly IKEA says, no, we only use FSC furniture, wood in our furniture. And Oil Público goes, well, there seems to be some problems with your certification company. Yeah, I think, tell us more. What was the thing? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it FSC is problematic, or IKEA is coming? Where are they getting their wood?
I think that this is there's a necessity of understand the complexity of the problem. It's not just a case of a group of a few people working illegally in the Amazon to share some trees to another country. It's a complex situation in which there's participation of corrupt political authorities in those regions. There are entrepreneurs or business people that are involved in illegal activities. There are the relation with the police, even in some cases. There's also a lack of oversight from the states in those regions because they are too far, too difficult to reach, and very isolated regions. And in which, by the way, there's a lot of menaces to environmental defenders. And we need to understand that the situation is very critical. I was reading some days ago a report in which NGO tells that in the last decade, at least 60 environmental defenders have been killed in those regions, just in Peru.
In Peru.
Yeah, and the last one was, the last case was in April, in which an historical leader of the Ashaninka people was killed at his home for drug traffickers, because in this region where there's a lack of the presence of the states, the originary peoples are taking the responsibility to take care of their territories. So For example, you probably are aware of the case of Don Phillips and Bruno Pereira, this couple of investigators that were killed in Brazil. They were investigating a case of illegal fishing, or where there was investigating in a zone where the illegal fishing is very common, very strong illegal activity.
Yeah.
So this is not an environmental story. This is this is the story. This is the announcement of a story that we're going to publish tomorrow in alliance with over 15 media outlets across the world.
Wow.
So, but this story started with this crime, and this Don Philip was investigating with the help of Bruno Pereira in a region in which illegal fishing is a very strong illicit activity. So the menace of the people that are trying to defend the territories, defend the environment, or defend their environment are critical. The situation is critical, and we need to understand that it's complex because it's not an anecdotic thing that the state withdraws the oversight of this the surveillance of these activities, or the protection of the territories. This is happening in Brazil, this is happening in Peru, this is happening in Bolivia, countries that are part of the Amazon region in South America. And we need to understand what are the dynamics of the criminal organizations that are working in the Amazon, in some zones, some areas that are triple borders. For example, the triple border in between Peru, Brazil, and Colombia. It's a very dangerous area. The same is in the border with Bolivia, and Brazil, and Peru. This area is these areas are isolated. There's the lack of the presence of the state is terrible. So they're abandoned to their fate.
I'm very glad that so many outlets have come together to, honor the story that Dom was working on. But has the other 60 people who were killed in the line of reporting these stories, did they get the same level of attention?
Well, I think that the coverage for this story is take the opportunity to make this recognition to the work of Dom and Bruno, but we're always covering these stories. This is not the first time in which we cover these kind of stories, as you saw some minutes ago.
Yeah.
And we're always trying to, for example, covering the cases of indigenous environmental defenders that are parasites in the Amazon and that have been killed in the recent years. And we're always saying we need to do something. We need to take action.
Right.
We need to take authorities into accountability, because it's not good. It's not correct that we left these sounds and we left these people, vulnerable people, in the risk of being killed or being exterminated, even from this or by these organizations.
Let me rephrase that. I know that you and your team are working tirelessly on these stories, but do you have the same level of eagerness from other countries and outlets to participate in collaborating on these stories, translating them and publishing them in other countries?
Yes.
Or has there been more interest in the Dom and Bruno story because of
No, I would say, to be fair, I would say that there are a lot of interest in the Amazon, and this story is part of this interest. Because I think that at least in the journalistic community, some some media understood in the recent years that we need to cover this story with this approach to explain the huge impact of these criminal activities. You cannot publish a story just limited to one country. You need to cover stories with a transnational approach to explain this. That's just because all these stories have impact in different countries. What is happening in Peru have impact in Bolivia, impact in Brazil. So you cannot avoid to understand that. This is a story about the situation in which Latin America has become the repository for other people's garbage. It's a dumping ground for plastic waste that is coming from Europe or coming from US. And there's thousands of tons of plastic waste that had ended up in landfills or oceans in Latin America. And we are not usually aware of this. And this investigation proved with data of different countries' customs and other sources that in the recent years, the amount of plastic waste that came to our countries from the other markets have increased enormously, specifically after 2021, because in some continents there are a lot of regulations that say that we cannot produce or produce plastic waste. In the global south, there are a lot of problems to apply our own regulations, and in the other side, there's poor capacity to oversight the accomplishments of this regulation by companies. The companies take advantage of this lack of oversight and the flaws of the system, and they are buying huge amounts of plastic waste. They just use what is useful for, or some of part of the waste that has economic value, and the other parts of those huge amounts of waste are just thrown in landfills or in other places with no regulations or with poor oversight. So we are becoming the dumping ground of the first world, for just saying.
So there's something specific I want to ask you about the story, and that is, I love the use of Mid-Journey to illustrate it, and I love all of the ways that you illustrate your stories. Tell me a little bit about Ojo Público's strategy around how you illustrate, who you hire to illustrate, and what formats you use. Do you have some principles we can learn from in that regard?
That's an important thing, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, we learned very early that we needed to develop and to take advantage of the new storytelling methods and ways and tools that had been developed in the rest of the world. So the first time we took as a model what was going on in the products made by New York Times or other important media in the international scene. But with the time we developed our new ways to tell stories. For example, we consider very important to provide and to give access the public to this data. So eventually we prepared some stories, for example, on the practices of the healthcare sector in Peru, and provide those data that could be read and analyzed by the readers. Part of it is to develop some interesting visualization of the use of illustration or video, because we understood that the current way to read information or to access the information is very different depending on what kind of audience. Young people usually watch the videos, or other people maybe are interested in the graphics or the data. Other people could be interested in the quality of the photography. No, so you can give the audiences different kind of access or approach to the story. Maybe someone does not want to read a large story, but could watch the video, or could be or could find entertaining the visualizations, or even, and sometimes ago we published a comic, interactive comic telling a story about a critical situation in the mining exploitation in the southern region in Peru, for example. That was a new way to obtain new audiences to this kind of stories, telling these stories not in a text, but in a comic that could be funny to see and funny to follow all the pages of the story. So we understood very early that we need to use the technology and use the new storytelling to explain complex situations, because since the beginning of the project, we decided to be the kind of project or media that provide stories that have public interest, that are important to know, important for the reader and for the citizen. And we cannot, for example, or at the moment, we decided not to publish stories on sports or the entertainment business. We focused on the political crisis and environmental crisis and issues that affect vulnerable populations. So we needed to ways to gain more audience, more readers with powerful visualizations, powerful photography and video. All the kind of storytelling that you can imagine and we can get.
It's brilliant. It's really brilliant. And how many, if you were to say this team of 15 that you have, how many are with visualization specialty and with data specialty and with reporting specialty, or do they have cross skills?
Yeah, we try to train the reporters with cross skills. Obviously, some of them are more skilled to work with, for example, visualizations, and when the visualization is complex or requires more complex, more knowledge, we hire a specialist, for example. But any report in Ojo Público could prepare a visualization with the tools that are available in the internet. So they are used to, the most important thing is that the ability to use the data, to analyze data. And if you have that skill, it's easy to go to a free tool and use it to expose the data. So the most difficult is to learn how to manage the data, how to analyze it, how to clean it, because as some people could know, the state is not accurate sometimes in the response. We need to be aware to not make a mistake.
I have a question for you from Felipe from Brazil, who says, how do you build trust across borders with those other teams to collaborate together?
Well, I would say that the reputation of Ojo Público helps us a lot, because during 9 years we have been publishing stories that have impact. At the beginning, of course, we started as a very small newsroom, and we were publishing stories that we knew that could have impact in other countries. We gather with other journalists in different seminars and other events. And in those events, we talk with other people and we say, we're investigating this, we have this proof, maybe we can share with you some information in order to prepare some stories. And that's the way in which you could build some trust between colleagues in other countries. And as I said some moments ago, I would say that the Panama Papers investigation was helpful to change the mindset in the journalistic community and showed us that you could build powerful networks to work in complex investigations.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then a question from Tarjei in Norway. He says, you mentioned sending people into very dangerous situations, that 60 people have lost their lives in the line of reporting these stories. What are you doing to prepare young reporters to go into that environment? What skills do you, or training or advice do you give them?
Well, we have a guide for risk coverage. So, for example, we never send a reporter with no contacts or with no previous preparation. We have a strict policy on what you can do as a reporter when you go to a danger zone. So, of course, you can never know what would happen.
You're never really prepared.
So you're never ready for this kind of situations, sadly, but we try to reduce the risk at maximum, and we train our journalists to not take responsible risk. So that's all explained in the guide that we have, and maybe if you could...
Yeah, let me just share this. I think because we're running out of time, there is so much really that I wanted, and we still could. I think we could talk for another 2 hours, David, and still be from you. But this guide is available. We'll share the links on all of our social networks. And it really does cover a lot of the topics that we haven't had time to get to, data security, visualizations, and how Ojo Público has positioned their team.
I just want to say about this project that this book was published in 2016. So some of the tools are probably or needs updating, because as you probably know, the technology evolution
moves fast.
Very fast. So, but the core of this explanation is that you need to change your mindset. You cannot be just a reporter that goes to make interview and writes a text. You need to use another or a lot of tools that are available now, and that would help you to analyze data, to uncover stories, to follow or to find new stories, and to explain complex problems. And this guide could give you a very confident idea.
Brilliant. So I'm taking from you today, I think the most fascinating lessons were the importance of identifying individual responsibility in environment stories, reframing environment stories as crime stories, and then also learning from how criminal enterprises operate. We need to operate at the same level of cross-border collaboration in order to cover these stories, that you have to embrace new tools to investigate these stories, the technology that's available, that and not only new tools and technologies for investigating, but new tools and technologies for presenting them in engaging ways in multimedia formats to attract multiple generations who prefer to receive their information in different ways. And then probably most crucial is to understand the complexity of these stories, that they involve both criminal elements, political elements, economic elements, law enforcement failures, the geography itself, and the hotspots that form at borders. David, I think your work is so important and so impressive, and I really hope that a lot of people watch this back and learn from you. And I wonder if you might set up some sort of masterclass for other journalists to come to. I know my continent, Africa, could learn so much from the South American approach to these problems, and more power to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor to be here with you.
Next week, we're back with Noah Landau from Haaretz in Israel, talking about the protests there. And David, thank you again, and keep doing the wonderful work that you do.
Thank you. Goodbye.